Hey there, I'm Dr. Barbara Woods, and I'm coming to you live from Manitoba, Canada, which is Treaty 1 territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Cree, Oji-Cree, and the traditional homelands of the Métis people. So today we are going to talk about how the parent or caregiver's complex trauma impacts the children. And you'll see this in generations if you're working with people with complex trauma and intergenerational trauma. And it might be kind of sneaky. It might be something that wasn't really recognized until you see this pattern in the parents, possibly grandparents, and the children. So we're going to look at how intergenerational trauma is passed on just briefly, definition of complex trauma, and the impacts of these on the parent and then on the child. So intergenerational trauma can be passed down really in four main ways. There's epigenetic changes, which are like when DNA gets kind of flagged, or a certain gene might get turned on or flagged, so that the next generation, if they face the same things that cause that gene to get flagged, that gene's ready to go and it kicks into action. So those are some of the changes that we really don't have a lot of control over, other than decreasing stress and helping have a good, healthy lifestyle. The second way intergenerational trauma is passed on is through the in utero environment. So when a mother is pregnant and the baby's developing, if there's certain stressors that happen, if the mom is in stressful conditions, if she's facing poverty, domestic violence, all of those kinds, mental health issues, it can impact the development of the baby. And the main impact for intergenerational trauma is related to a brain circuit that develops, I believe it's in the third trimester, that has to do with emotion regulation. So the third way is that the early developmental environment would be traumatic, wouldn't support attachment, maybe involvement with child welfare systems, things like that, exposure to crime and violence, things that impact the early development of the child. And this is really where we're going to kind of zero in today. And then the last way these are passed on are patterns within the family system. So some therapy systems call this like unconscious loyalty, entanglements. There's also some cultural beliefs around for certain groups of people. Primarily in my work with Indigenous people, you'll see kind of the characteristics of an ancestor kind of show up in some of the children. So there's some cultural beliefs around that as well, which is really critical and important for us to understand and recognize when we're working with people. So let's get into the definition of complex trauma. And this is from complextrauma.org. So it's basically exposure to traumatic conditions during critical or vulnerable developmental periods. So as a child is developing, there are certain periods that they're supposed to meet developmental tasks, or their brain is developing in a certain way, and one part will accelerate during a specific time frame. And if they experience trauma during those critical developmental periods, it can absolutely impact their development, their brain development, and their relationships and attachment. So the next part of complex trauma is it really impacts attachment. It creates difficulties in the parent-child relationship for the parent as they were growing up. And then they don't have the skills or the experiences of how to make it better for their child, or they try and they'll make changes, but there'll still be some kind of remnants of things related to this complex trauma. Absolutely impacts brain development. So there's emotion regulation circuits. There's the one that develops in utero. There's another one that develops in the first 3 years of life. I can't remember the months that it develops, but if they experience trauma during that developmental period, when that second emotion regulation circuit is developing, they'll have emotion regulation difficulties. So they may have an overactive limbic system, which is that fight, flight, and freeze response, that drives behavior and creates all kinds of difficulty with neurocepting threat and danger when there may not be any. And because the limbic system has kind of hijacked all the energy in the brain, you can have some difficulties with decreased higher cognitive functions. So it's really hard for them to learn language or problem solve or have impulse control. So those are those higher cognitive functions that tend to be impacted as well. Hi, Patricia. It's great to see you here. So I see your question, and I will get to that at the end of the live stream. So thank you for submitting that. It's a great question. So the complex trauma also causes huge deficits in emotional, behavioral, somatic, so body awareness, and cognitive regulation. It really shakes everything up and makes it really difficult for the person who's been impacted by it. So the main characteristics of complex trauma is that emotion dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation. They can have difficulties with maintaining attention and consciousness. So they may kind of check out or numb out or go into that kind of dorsal vagal freeze response. There's a higher degree of dissociation, so they'll miss pieces of information. It'll look like they're listening, and then they won't kind of do what you ask them to do, and they can't remember what you've asked them to do. They can also look like they have ADHD, but it may be the impact on the brain from the trauma rather than an actual ADHD process or diagnosis. There's difficulties with cognitive and information processing. So again, when the limbic system, or the kind of the middle part of the brain, starts to hijack everything, those other structures in the cortex don't develop as well, and they don't process information as well. So you'll see learning difficulties reading, reasoning, judgment, all those higher cortical functions. They can have huge relationship disruptions because we learn how to have relationships through our attachments with adults when we're kids. So if a child has really stormy relationships with parents, if they're scaring the child or if they're fearful of the parents, it can create huge ramifications in relationships later. They also have distorted expectations of self and others. They may expect everybody's out to get me and I'm going to get them first, or they may feel like they're not lovable, or there's something wrong with them, or they're a bad person. So we see those develop, and they kind of go underground and start to really drive behavior without a lot of conscious awareness. Between about ages 5 and 7, it's a period of cognitive development where children are really prone to developing self-beliefs that may not be accurate, and they can't fact check them to make sure to see if they're accurate or not. Then there's also the biological impacts. So those are on the actual brain structures themselves. It's that somatic awareness. Some people who have complex trauma, they really don't have awareness of their body, of their sensations, of hunger, of pain. I've seen kids get really hurt or touch something really hot, and it doesn't even faze them because they don't have that somatic awareness. And then there's also long-term health complications that can develop later in life if there's no way to address the stress that they're under at that time. So as a result of the impacts of the parent's own complex trauma, they're at a huge disadvantage when it comes to parenting. But it's not all bad because they can receive therapy and support, earn security, develop those skills, and then things are very different for their children. But we have to understand how this impacts the parent above and beyond what we have just talked about with the complex trauma characteristics. So the two major impacts are structures on brain development and the brain structures, and on attachment. So those are the two primary areas that parents will be impacted, and then it impacts their children. So some brain structures, again, have those critical periods for development. If trauma happens during that time, there's a greater impact on those structures. So if you can kind of track, if there hasn't been chronic stress over a long period of time in trauma exposure, if you can track kind of when a trauma happened, you can almost kind of figure out what developmental or brain structure might be involved. So there's greater autonomic reactivity. So that's your fight, flight, and freeze response. That is due to the disrupted brain development. It's that limbic system that becomes very efficient at detecting threat and danger, but it may actually be faulty. So this is an adaptation in a high stress environment. So they need to have this greater autonomic reactivity to survive a difficult circumstance. But when they're not in that difficult circumstance, there's lasting impacts on the parent-child relationship. They may have chronic nervous system and emotional or behavioral dysregulation. So they may have difficulties controlling their anger, losing their temper, becoming consumed, being upset or anxious, or trauma responses. And that's because the parent's nervous system is still so focused on survival, and it's living under constant threat. Even if there's not threat there, they're living under that constant threat. And they can get so preoccupied with these difficulties, the emotional behavioral dysregulation, that it negatively impacts attachment. So they might be anxious, can't handle a baby crying. It makes them upset. They feel bad. So they put a baby in the room and don't go in there, let the baby cry it out. But then the baby is actually probably shutting down and dissociating. So it really impacts the parent-child relationship. And then now we're going to get into attachment. So the impacts on attachment, in addition to what I've spoken about just a few seconds ago, is that it really impacts co-regulation. So that's the ability of one person's nervous system to influence another person's nervous system in a positive or negative way. So if I'm really calm and am interacting with somebody, they're more likely to kind of either calm down or feel calm. If I'm nervous and fidgety and look very anxious, that the other person is likely to be like, "Ooh, something, what is going on here?" So that's co-regulation. And this is really important in the parent-child relationship, because that's how kids learn self-regulation later. If they don't have that co-regulation, they can't self-regulate when they get older. So then they end up in school. They're impulsive, they're having a lot of difficulties, they have behavioral difficulties, and it's because they didn't learn how to self-regulate. So there's also a lot of misattunement. So parents will misread signals of kids or children, and then they won't be able to meet the need of what the child has at the time. So the child might get really scared from seeing something scary on TV, and the parents just like, "It's just a movie, get over it," kind of thing. So that's a misattunement. So in addition to misattuning and not picking up the cues and signals of the child or infant well, there's also a lack of repair. So when relationships experience kind of a rupture or a misattunement or something that's kind of hurtful for one of the people, The important part is going back and repairing, because we can't be 100% on all the time. I think the research shows you only need to be like 33% attuned all the time. And if you hit that 33%, that's enough to be a good enough parent. So that's hopeful. But when there's no repair, when there is a rupture, it leaves kind of a distance or some negative emotion or energy in that relationship between the parent and child. So now we're going to look at the impacts on the next generation. How does this impact a child through that parent-child relationship? And this is exactly what impacted the parent when they experienced their own trauma in their own childhood. So the parent may be unable to manage a stress response, their reactivity to threat, so they become so preoccupied with threat and sensitive to it, or they don't recognize it at all, and there can be chaos going on, and the parents just don't react to it because they're shut down. So the parent's autonomic reactivity, so that high fight, flight, freeze response, creates an environment that's like filled with fear. It's associated with disorganized attachment as well. And how that association with disorganized attachment happens is the parent becomes either frightening to the child, or the parent's frightened and the child has to step in. So when a parent becomes frightening to the child, when they're scary in the presence of the child and in the parent-child relationship, it's really unpredictable. And there's a lot of reactivity and there's high frustration. A lot of times, kids in that kind of environment will numb out and shut down, but then they'll explode in other environments or kind of episodically. So this frightening and scary environment and part of the parent-child relationship, it really overstimulates the child's autonomic responses and stress response. So they're constantly in that fight or flight as well. So when the parent becomes frightened and the child learns to protect the parent, this is what we would call, it's part of parentification. They might try to protect siblings or might raise the siblings so that, because the parent isn't able to be there. So the child is focusing on survival. And because they have to focus on survival so much because the parent isn't leading, because they're filled with fear and the reactivity, the child can't meet these developmental tasks in the way that they need to, and they also have greater autonomic reactivity or that fight, flight, and freeze response. So the child in this equation has a lot greater stress levels and threats if they don't have a healthy parent-child relationship for that co-regulation. So kids get scared. Parents might frighten their kids if they, I don't know, drop something, get upset. But if there's not that co-regulation and they don't come back and repair, the child has a huge degree of stress and they have a huge perception or neuroception of threats in the environment. Interestingly, the parent may also have a history of disorganized attachment. And without intervention to reach earned security, you'll see a lot of impacts. So there is a lot of research that has shown that parents who have a disorganized or insecure, anxious, or avoidant attachment, when they go through therapy or they are able to earn security in a relationship, so they develop a secure attachment, these impacts on the child they're not there. So they can have a healthy relationship, they can attune, they can co-regulate, and they can do all those things that the child needs to grow up without these impacts. So the impacts on the parent-child relationship is that poor attunement. So they may see the child's crying as personal towards them. You'll hear people say sometimes that this kid is really trying to drive me nuts. He's just always crying like that. And it's really that the child isn't getting what the child needs, and the parent is interpreting it very personally, and they're misattuned. They get really frustrated sometimes with the child's attachment demands. So if a child becomes clingy, needy, crying, kind of needing that comfort, they can get really frustrated because their nervous system is already heightened and it rattles them even further. And again, they're unable to repair those misattunements, which is a huge part of that co-regulation and attachment. Sometimes, on the other hand, of the high stress, reactive parent, there may be an understimulation of the infant or child due to neglect. So the parent may be consumed with what's happening in their environment, and they're not paying attention to the child. They're not on a good feeding schedule for infants. They're not attending to the basics of what the child needs, which is a neglectful situation. So both this under and overstimulation is related to the development of disorganized attachment. And these parents, sometimes they can't co-regulate with the child. So, and again, this is how self-regulation develops. So the child will end up shifting between hyperarousal, fight and flight, and hypoarousal, which is that freeze or kind of shutting down response. So what happens over time is the child ends up having like a constricted social engagement way of being. So they have trouble connecting, they have trouble calming, being regulated. Or if you're familiar with the window of tolerance, it will get constricted. So it's easy to get out of regulation. It's easy to become dysregulated, and it's hard to get back in the window of tolerance or get back to social engagement. And it ends up, that's what creates a lot of the difficulties for these kids with emotional behavioral responses. And their nervous systems they're not resilient. So they can't handle stress. They react quicker, they shut down quicker. And it's just kind of a cascading effect of all these impacts. So because of that traumatic nature of the parent-child relationship, relationships for kids impacted in this intergenerational transmission of trauma, they become highly triggering. They're a trauma reminder for the child. So relationships become extremely threatening. So a child impacted by intergenerational trauma goes to school, the teacher sets a limit or has expectations, and the child that's going to be threatening to the child. So you might get a defensive response where they might fight back, they might become verbal, or they might just shut down and not participate in learning. So it's really the impact on relationships with the parent, but also with other people in later in life are immense for this in this scenario. So the impacts of the brain development in intergenerational trauma, they actually combine with any kind of epigenetic changes or markers or kind of red flags on a gene that will express when there's a stressor. So this can create even greater disruption. So if you have a family that has had multiple generations that are impacted by intergenerational trauma, you're going to see more and more impacts because of the epigenetic changes through all of those generations and the impact on brain development currently for the child in the here and now. So it's not all bad. The good news is that most parents have a desire to do better for their kids. They want their kids to have it different than what they had. So they're motivated because they don't want that pattern to continue that they experienced. And these are skills that can be developed with support. If the parent resolves their own complex trauma, they're much more present and available for the child. And then it starts to shift that back to be a healthier scenario for both the parent and the child. So parents who shift from that insecure or disorganized attachment style, so that you're avoidant, anxious and disorganized, if they shift towards more earned security, there's positive outcomes on the attachment. So there's hope here, and it's not a given that these impacts are going to have a significant influence in the next generation, and that cycle can really be stopped. So if we're able to stabilize the family system and address that parent's unresolved trauma, there's a huge impact on that child or teen, and there's a huge impact for the parent. So that is how intergenerational trauma is transmitted through the complex trauma of the parent in certain cases. So there's a question from Patricia that says, what can you say about children that had difficult experience while being born and children in the NICU? So this is really important because from 0 to 3, that's really the foundation of attachment. And attachment can be healed, it can be flexible. So it's not, if things happen 0 to 3, it doesn't automatically translate into problems later on, but there's huge impacts. And basically what happens, so this is like a pre-verbal, the child can't speak, they can't label because they're an infant, they can't say, wow, that was scary, but mom came to get me and mom made it okay, or dad made it okay. So they don't have the words to label it. So it kind of goes underground in what we would call implicit memories. So those memories are not consciously known for the child. They really can't be remembered, but they may have greater autonomic reactivity. So they may be more defensive. They may be more shut down. So they're going to be more difficult to soothe. They're going to be more difficult to connect with. So if the parent has intergenerational trauma, there's a difficult birth, or they're in the NICU and they can't have a parent there with them all the time and doing all the skin-to-skin contact and all those things that help build attachment, there's going to be huge impacts for the child, but they won't be able to verbalize them. It'll be kind of in some automatic responses and behavior because it's in that implicit memory. So I kind of use the analogy that this is like the operating system of your computer. We use the applications and we really don't think about the operating system until something goes wrong, you get a virus or something isn't working, because it messes everything else up. So so there are ways, like a lot of interventions can work with trauma that's pre-verbal or that doesn't have words attached to it. So those will be like your brain spotting, your EMDR, some probably somatic experiencing, where they can address those impacts even with there not being words attached to them. And here's Mohammed. Hi, it's great to see you too. So that's the impact of the parent's complex trauma on the child and on the attachment. So if you would like a summary of this live stream this afternoon, I will be developing that, and you can just drop a comment below the live stream and I will either post it as a comment or I will send it to you in a message. So if you would like that summary, just let me know. So I hope you have a beautiful day and I hope this was helpful.